Hey everyone, welcome back to another edition of Video Swift. Hopefully we don't have to keep doing these for too much longer. I do like giving my lessons in person more than to a computer. But we'll keep doing it as long as we need to, because who knows with the way coronavirus is going if we're going to have to keep doing this, or if we can meet in person other than for outdoor activities like bonfires. Speaking of which, it was great to see all of you last week at the bonfire. We'll do a few more of those in the coming weeks. We won't do anything next week. Next week we're off completely because I'm getting married on Saturday. So no Swift of any sort that Sunday. I'm going to be a little preoccupied to prepare a lesson this way, and we're not meeting because obviously I won't be around because I'll be getting married the day before. So no Swift next week. And then on the 26th, we will do another bonfire. And we'll probably do a few more structured activities at this bonfire than we did last week. Maybe a couple games as a group. But yeah, we'll approach that when it comes. So 2 weeks on the 26th, we will have another bonfire. Nothing next week. That's all the announcements I have for this week. So let's dive into the lesson. So if you'll recall, our lessons have been going through the stories of Scripture. Kind of giving you a feel for the timeline of ancient Israel. We started way back in the beginning with Genesis. We went through the stories of Abraham and his descendants into the book of Exodus and the Israelites in slavery and their escape from slavery. And then we talked about some of the stories when they were wandering in the wilderness. And then that led into the conquest of the Promised Land, starting with Jericho and going out from there. And then the time of the judges, and then the time of the kings, and then the exile from the Promised Land when they were conquered by Babylon, sent out to live in exile in the Empire of Babylon, and then their eventual return to the Promised Land. We touched on that briefly. So last time, a couple weeks ago, we talked about the book of Daniel. And the book of Daniel takes place during the exile, right? Today we are going to look at another book of the Bible that takes place during the exile. That would be the book of and the story of Esther. Esther is an interesting story about a young Jewish girl who rises to power in the Persian Empire. So it was when Persia was in charge after they conquered Babylon. So a young Jewish girl who rises to power in the Persian Empire while in exile from the Promised Land. So let's get into it. The book of Esther opens by introducing us to the king. And depending on your translation, it'll be Xerxes or Ahasuerus. One is kind of the Greek equivalent. One is the Hebrew. It's the same guy, Xerxes, Ahasuerus. In this lesson, we'll refer to him as Xerxes because that's what my translation had. So Xerxes was the son of King Darius. We talked about Darius last time. And an interesting note about Xerxes, if you've seen the movie 300 about the Spartan battle of Thermopylae, if you've seen that movie, the king of the Persians, the bad guys in that film, is named Xerxes. It's the same guy. The Xerxes in Esther is the same historical figure as the Xerxes in 300. Obviously 300 took some liberties, but it's the same. It's based on the same figure, same historical figure. Just an interesting note. Anyway, so the book of Esther opens with Xerxes throwing a huge banquet for all of his nobles and officials. It lasted for 7 full days, so 7 days of feasting. And during this time, his queen, Vashti, hosted a banquet for the women in the royal palace. So a separate banquet for the women. Vashti was hosting that. On the 7th day, King Xerxes commanded his men to bring Queen Vashti to him so that he could display her beauty for all to see. She was a beautiful woman, and Xerxes wanted everybody to admire her. However, when the king's servants delivered this order to the queen, she refused. She wouldn't come before him. So the king was furious, and he consulted with his officials about what was to be done. And the officials definitely wanted to make sure something was done because they didn't want other women to follow the queen's example and defy their husbands, because this was a time when that wasn't done. And if the queen wasn't punished, then the other women would think they could do it and not be punished too. So the officials told the king to declare that the queen could never again come into the king's presence, and that she would in fact be replaced by another. And so this decree was written, and it was sent out. And then soon, after Xerxes' anger had cooled a bit, he decided that he should probably find someone to replace Vashti. His officials proposed that a search be organized for beautiful young virgins to be found for the king. Commissioners in every province of the kingdom would find some women and bring them into the king's harem in the capital city of Susa. Then, whichever of those virgins that went into his harem pleased the king the most would become the next queen. And this is where Esther comes in. Esther was a young Jewish woman living in Susa during the time of the exile. She was raised by her older cousin by the name of Mordecai. She was one of the women chosen to go into the king's harem. And during that time that Esther was in the harem, she did not reveal her nationality or family background. In other words, she didn't let anybody know that she was Jewish. In part because Mordecai had told her not to. Now, why would that be? Why should she not reveal who she was? Well, Jewish people were still considered outsiders in the nation. Remember, they had been conquered and then sent to live in exile throughout this kingdom that wasn't theirs. So they were considered outsiders. They were often looked down upon, and the king would certainly not make a Jewish woman his queen. So Esther did not reveal that she was Jewish, and she made a good impression on everybody she met. She impressed everybody, and she rose in standing among the young women. And the king was more impressed with Esther than with any of the other young women. And he set a royal crown on her head and made her his new queen. Now, during this time, while Esther was being chosen, Mordecai would hang out at the king's gate, listening for some news, that kind of stuff. So he was there. And shortly after Esther had been named queen, Mordecai was sitting at the gate, as usual, and he heard two of the guards conspire to assassinate the king. Mordecai heard that, and then he went and he told Esther, who again had recently been named the queen. He told her about the plot, and she told the king, giving credit to Mordecai. When it was investigated and found to be true, the guards were executed, but Mordecai was not rewarded for his service. And that'll be important later, but Mordecai essentially saved the king, and he wasn't rewarded. So a while after that, King Xerxes honored a man named Haman, and he made him essentially second in command. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman when he would pass, but Mordecai did not. Now Haman was angry with Mordecai, and when he found out that Mordecai was Jewish, he decided to take his anger out on not just Mordecai, that wasn't enough, but on his entire people. Haman decided to find a way to get rid of all the Jewish people in the kingdom. Let's see what Haman does. This is found in Esther 3, verses 8 to 15. Again, that's Esther 3, verses 8 to 15. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. "Keep the money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." Then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as a law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so that they would be ready for that day. The couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. So Haman came up with a plan to have all the Jews living in the kingdom killed. And he got the king to sign off on it by telling him that they kept themselves apart and they refused to follow the king's laws, and so they should not be tolerated. Now, when Mordecai heard about this, he was understandably upset. He tore his clothes. He put on sackcloth and ashes. This was a sign of mourning in the ancient times. It was a sign that things were not as they should be. And after he had done that, he went to the king's gate, wailing loudly. Now, when Esther heard of this, she sent someone to see what was wrong. And Mordecai told the servant that she sent everything that Haman had done, and gave the servant a copy of the edict. And he urged her, he being Mordecai, urged Esther to go to the king and beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Esther said that she could not, because of a law that said that anybody who entered the presence of the king without being summoned would be put to death, unless the king decided to spare them, which wasn't very common. And it had been 30 days since she had last been called before the king. Let's see what Mordecai's answer to that was. This is found in Esther 4:12 through 17. Again, that's Esther chapter 4, verses 12 through 17. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. So Esther came around. She agreed with Mordecai's words, that she had been put in her position for such a time as this. And that even if she didn't go, God would raise another to save his people. She decides to go, but she asks Mordecai to gather all the people he can to fast and to pray for her, so that the king listens and doesn't kill her. So then, 3 days later, Esther goes before the king, and the king does spare her life for coming unsummoned. He tells her that he will give her anything she wants, even up to half the kingdom. Now, it's pretty clear what Esther wants, right? We know what she wants, but she doesn't ask for it right away. Instead, she requests that the king summon Haman for a banquet with just the 3 of them, and then she will tell the king what she wants from him. The king agrees to this, and Haman feels honored, and he's happy with his invitation, figuring that he alone gets to go have a feast with the king and the queen. That's a pretty big honor. So Haman leaves that evening happy. But when he sees Mordecai outside the gate, because Mordecai's still in his spot at the king's gate, he grows angry again. And when he gets home, he asks his wife what to do about Mordecai. And he follows her advice to build some translations say a gallows, but it's essentially a wooden pole, 75 feet high, outside their house on which to hang Mordecai. 50 cubits might be in your translation, but 50 cubits is about 75 feet. So a big wooden pole to hang Mordecai on to kill him. But that night, something interesting happens. The king couldn't sleep. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles, which had the record of everything important that had happened during his reign, to be read to him. In that book, it was recorded that Mordecai had exposed the plot to kill the king. The king asked what had been done to honor Mordecai, and when he heard that nothing had been done, he sent for someone to help him figure out how to honor him. And now this was getting to be earlier in the morning, so Haman was back from his house, and he was in the court of the palace. And so he was the only official around, and so he was brought before the king so the king could consult with him. Now, the king didn't know about Haman's grudge against Mordecai, otherwise he wouldn't have asked him how to honor him, right? But let's see what happened next. This is in Esther 6, starting at verse 6. Esther chapter 6, verse 6 through verse 14. So Esther 6 through 14. When Haman entered, the king asked him, "What should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought to himself, "Who is there that the king would rather honor than me?" So he answered the king, "For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" "Go at once," the king commanded Haman. "Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief and told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. So the king asked Haman what to do for the man that he wished to honor, and Haman, being pretty arrogant, figured that he was the man to be honored. So he came up with all these really lavish things. And then the king said, "Sounds great. Go do that for Mordecai." How do you think Haman felt there? I would imagine not great. His greatest enemy is being honored way above anything the king has ever done for him. And he has to deliver those honors to Mordecai himself. Now, after he had done that, he went home in shame. And then people, the king's eunuchs, his servants, came to take him to the feast that Esther had prepared, where he thought he was being honored again, to feast in the presence of the king and the queen. Now, we're just going to read the next chapter. This is Esther chapter 7, to see what happens at the banquet. So again, this is all of Esther 7. So listen to this. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. And as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king asked again, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing?" Esther said, "An adversary, an enemy, this vile Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" As soon as the words left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole, reaching to a height of 50 cubits, stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." The king said, "Impale him on it." So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. Poor Haman. Nothing goes his way in the second half of this story. He has plans for everything, and they all backfire spectacularly. He thinks he's going to be honored by the king, but then he has to give those honors to Mordecai. He thinks he's being honored by Esther with the banquet, but she calls him out on his plans to exterminate her people and reveals that she is Jewish as well. He builds a 75-foot pole on which to hang his enemy Mordecai. And then he gets hung on it himself. Nothing goes his way. After he is killed on the pole, his estate is given to Esther, and Mordecai is honored even higher than before. Now, a quick note here. Some translations of the Bible will say a gallows was built, that Haman built a gallows to hang Mordecai, and so our initial thought is the gallows that we see in like Old West things, like with the game Hangman, that gallows, and that's not the case here. A gallows in the ancient Persian Empire was a pole that somebody was impaled on to die, and Haman built his so tall so that everybody would see Mordecai's body on it and know what had been done. And obviously that backfired, and so everybody saw Haman's body on it and saw and knew what he had done because his body was displayed so prominently. Okay, moving on. So Mordecai is honored by the king. When he comes before Xerxes, the king takes the signet ring that he had given to Haman before, and he gives it to Mordecai instead. Now, this signet ring lets Mordecai and Haman before him speak with the authority of the king. It lets him send written things that have the king's seal on it, so that it's as if the king is saying these things himself. So Mordecai and Esther requested that the king issue a new edict to not kill the Jews in the kingdom, and to give them the right to assemble and fight back, to protect themselves, to the point of killing and destroying anybody who raises arms against them. This was done, and the Jewish people in the kingdom indeed prevailed over their enemies when the day came that Haman had said in that first edict to rise up and annihilate the Jewish people. The Jewish people protected themselves and instead killed, destroyed, and annihilated all their enemies who rose up against them. So the Jewish people defeated a lot of people that day, and the next. It went on for a few days. And those the men that were defeated included the 10 sons of Haman, who Esther then requested be hung on poles as well, to show the sins of Haman and his sons. And the story ends with Mordecai being raised up to second in command under Xerxes. Now, why does this matter? So that's the story of Esther. Why does it matter? Why do we need to learn this? And again, some of this is going to be similar to what we talked about at the end of the lesson last week. Not last week, but last time. It's Scripture, right? All Scripture is God-breathed and useful for a whole host of things. So all Scripture is important to know. And it helps us to know who Jesus is, because it teaches us where he came from. The Old Testament is the Jewish scriptures. It's the history of the Jewish people. It's everything that they held dear. And so this is what Jesus learned. He knew and believed. This was Jesus's Bible, essentially. Knowing the Old Testament helps us to understand Jesus even more and to know the culture that he was born into. Also, it's just a good story, right? It's good to know it because it's a good story. And then finally, it teaches us about God. Interestingly, God is not directly mentioned once in the book of Esther. God is, of course, referred to obliquely and is very obviously at work throughout the story of Esther. But God is not explicitly mentioned once in that book. God put Esther in the high place in which she found herself for such a time as that, as Mordecai said. Remember, you've been put there for such a time as this. And he meant put there by God, right? And Mordecai shows his faith in God by claiming that if Esther doesn't bring the petition to the king, if Esther doesn't save the people, that God would raise somebody else up to save his people. Mordecai says that without mentioning God. He says somebody else will be raised up. But it's clearly a faith in God that he has this, right? He says he's saying God will raise somebody else up to save the people. God clearly worked through Mordecai and through Esther and through King Xerxes to save the Jewish people in the Persian kingdom. This story shows that God will work to save his people and that he will use anybody from the lowly to the highly exalted in that culture. So what places have we been put in to enact the will of God? What places have we found ourselves where we are called to do the will of God? I would say every place that we find ourselves, every station in life, every moment of our life, we need to look for where we can do the will of God. And outside of a situation like Esther's, where it was clear, at least to us, in hindsight and reading the story, what she had to do, what is the will of God that we are called to do? So outside of a situation like Esther's, what is the will of God that we are called to do? Here's what I think. The two greatest commandments, according to Jesus himself, are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. That is what we are called to do. Love. Love God with all that we have and all that we are, and love our neighbors as ourselves. So that is what we need to do. Love with every ounce of our being. Love God and love others. Everything we do, no matter what, needs to be done in love. That is one of the big things I get from Esther. God puts us wherever we are in life for a reason. And that reason is to follow his commands and love unconditionally. We need to keep that in mind as we live our lives. As Christians, no matter where we're put in our lives, we are called to live our lives in love. And remember, that doesn't just mean to love the people that are easy to love. It doesn't just mean to love the people that are like us, who look like us, who act like us, who believe the same things we do. We are to love everybody, no matter what. Jesus said, right, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. Love. We are called to love everybody, no matter who they are, no matter what they've done to us or to anybody else. We are called to love. And we need to figure out what that looks like. So that's our lesson for today. And I only have one reflection question this week. I know usually I have a lot, but I just have one. And I want you to think deeply on it. Spend some time thinking about this question. Feel free to write some answers in the comments if you want, but at least think about it. What positions have you been put in your lives to show love to your neighbors? And how can you more fully show love to God and to your neighbors in your lives? And who can you show more love to? It's kind of a 3-part question, but it's one question. So again, that's what positions have you been put in to show love to your neighbors? How can you more fully show love to God and to your neighbors in your life? And who can you love more fully? So think about that. And I challenge you to act on that too. Don't just think about it. Act on it. Go out and love. That's what we need to do, right? So that's it for today. Remember, no lesson next week because I'm getting married. And then a bonfire at 6 p.m. on the 26th. That'll be behind the church again. Bring a mask. When we're playing games, you don't have to wear it. But if we're standing around talking closer than 6 feet, please wear that mask. So bring a mask to the bonfire. But yeah, we'll have a bonfire on the 26th, 6 p.m. behind the church. If you have any questions or comments, if you want us to pray for anything, you can reach out to me or any of the other sponsors, or you can leave a comment on this video. Just get in touch. We're happy to do anything you need. We're happy to pray for you. Whatever you need, just let us know. Yeah, that's all we got. See you soon.